So good morning. I'll get us formally started then. Thank you all for your patience and for being here this morning. I think you'll be well rewarded by our guest, who is in Washington for the first time in a while, I think. In a year, yeah. And really is one of the most reliable, independent, and perceptive analysts of events in Afghanistan, as you'll hear for yourselves in a few minutes. Martine van Bijlert has been in Kabul since 2002?
2004 full-time, and before that, I visited 2002, 2003. Yeah.
And her experience is not just located in Afghanistan, but in the region as well. I know that she was posted in Tehran for a while at the Dutch embassy there. She now co-directs the Afghan Analysts Network, which is an independent non-profit, I guess, a non-governmental organization based in Kabul that publishes deep analytical research about political and military developments in Afghanistan. There are several regular contributors who work with Martina, and also a network of very interesting writers and researchers who travel and collaborate with them. Martina's also been a very regular contributor to the AFPAC channel, published online by Foreign Policy magazine, which is upstairs. I'm sure many of you are recipients of Catherine's daily brief on the AFPAC channel, and you'll probably encounter Martina's work there. But I'd also commend the Afghan Analyst Network's own website to you, because if you poke around over the last few years, a lot of the research that they have been doing back when there didn't appear to be a series of cascading crises in Afghanistan is now, I think, proving itself to be prescient and remains very useful. So it's not just the current work, but the archive that I'd recommend to you. What we'll do today, we're on the record. Obviously, we're webcasting. We have probably as many folks watching us at their desks as are physically here. We're on the record. Good time to turn your phones down if you haven't thought to do that already. Martina will come up and speak 15 or 20 minutes about where Western strategy and Afghan realities intersect at this important moment of change in military leadership in the United States. And then I'll probably ask her a few questions when we sit back down. And when we're done with that, we'll turn to you. When we do that, please wait for the microphones to circulate, and when they reach you, identify yourself and try to be concise. Thanks very much, and please now join me in welcoming Martina to the microphone.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very pleased to be here. I don't know, should I talk in this one or this one? It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
Both of them will get me. Okay. The title of today's talk was Afghanistan Today, Karzai, Reconciliation and International Strategy, and that is what I'll very briefly focus on. There's obviously a lot to say about politics and international strategy and Karzai and reconciliation. I'll just be brief and give some thoughts, and then we can do the rest in the discussions. When we look at our international strategy in Afghanistan, one of the dilemmas we face is President Karzai. It's his government, it's himself, and it's our relationship with him. It's been like that for many years, but it's become really to a head, I would say, under this administration, because the relationship changed between this administration and the president. What was a key event in that relationship was the election, last year presidential elections, the run-up to the election, and the aftermath. And one of the big messages that the President Karzai got there from the international community is they are not sure they want to keep me. They are not sure they want to have me as a president. And that is something that he's very much internalized, I think, and it shapes the relationship that we have as internationals and as international community with Karzai. And so we waver between sort of very bad moments, moments of crisis, which then get patched up. Things seem fine again. He's being talked up as a strong leader because we need a strong leader and as a strong partner. But deep down, there's this mistrust. they don't actually want me. They're not sure they want me as a president. And it very much shapes his calculations and how he deals with us. What we have then, and what we've had for years, is a combination of trying to pressure him and his government to behave in ways we want, and to be friends, to placate. You could call it carrot and stick. I'm not sure if that's exactly what it is. It hasn't been that effective so far, and it is really a dilemma. We are somehow stuck with each other. Karzai feels, I think, very uncomfortable in this relationship, but would also feel very uncomfortable if the internationals were not there. And same here. I think on the international side, people have really thought, can we work like this? Is this possible? But if not, what else? And it makes for difficult strategizing. On the reconciliation issue, it's been very clear for years, and particularly if you talk to Afghans, they would tell you this conflict is not going to be solved militarily. You cannot fight your way out of it. It needs to have a political solution. It wasn't always very clear to people what that meant, but for years that's been the message. It's also been a message we've been given. You cannot fight your way out of this. I think this is now very much also sort of found its way into mainstream strategizing in very different shapes. Initially, the political solution to the conflict was very much seen in terms of better governance. And it was the narrative, which is true, is that considerable parts of the insurgency are being caused by grievances, by people being pushed out, by how people have been treated, and that better governance will take away at least that part of the insurgency. So that we've been on that track now for several years. There's been a problem that we haven't understood what governance means, and we haven't really understood that governance is something very political. It's not something that you do with programs. It's also not necessarily something that has to do with technical capacity building, at least not in what we're trying to work with in Afghanistan. Then the political settlement moved into sort of the reintegration discussions. You try to peel off those that are not political. You try to peel off those that are fight mainly for economic incentives or because they have nothing else to do, which you need to do. If you have a political strategy, you need to have a reintegration strategy alongside of it. For quite a while, what the problem was that it seemed to be our main strategy, and we seem to believe that if you peeled off enough, you could somehow weaken the insurgency, which I don't think is correct. Now, with things moving on the ground in Kabul, we've had the peace jirga, which has endorsed some form of plan. There's a document. There's probably not really a plan or a strategy yet. But now more and more we're getting into the discourse and into the debate a much higher level of political settlement. It's not really clear who is working on that, where it's going, what it would mean, but it's definitely there. One of the most remarkable things there, I would say, is how Pakistan has entered into the arena. The picking up of the Taliban commanders earlier this year really was a message. If you want to do something, we need to be there. We have the access. We're very well placed. It's very interesting to see how Karzai has changed around his attitude towards Pakistan over the last years. It moved from public bashing to actually seeing them as a potential partner. As a potential partner who might be giving him assurances, I'm guessing, but who might be giving him assurances that he can stay. So that we definitely are having, there's a feeling of momentum there, although it's not very, very clear how much might be really happening there, and who will play a role. There's a lot of concerns, I would say, inside Afghanistan among the population, although at the moment it's being muted by the fact that people are not yet sure what they should be concerned about because it's not yet sure where it's going. But there is this feeling that, again, as people have felt over the years, things are being somehow stitched up over their heads, that those who actually count will not be part of it, the population who suffers from the insurgency, possibly even the fighters, and it might be quite a high political deal involving the Afghan government, possibly the Pakistani government, possibly some parts of the insurgency, with support of the international community, would be really happy to have anything that looks like a solution or a deal. And there is quite some concern that there will be a deal that will not take into account what it would mean for the population and for the various groups within the population. Our strategy, the sense I get very much is that we're that there's an increasing realization of the fact that we're somewhat stuck. That we do have strategies, we're not sure they're going to work. We're not sure they're going to come together enough to we're not even sure whether we should stay or whether we should leave. And I think I'll leave that for the discussion.
Thank you. So let me just pick up where you left off, Martine, because this, let's take as a presumption of our discussion that the political strategy is the most important track that the international community has in front of it now. It's the track where our success will determine whether, or failure will determine whether or not Afghanistan descends back into a civil war. It will determine the pace at which the Taliban can gain territory or not. And it's also the track of strategy that seems the least nourished in the West, certainly in the United States. Where it is discussed, as you point out, it almost always comes up as governance, development, a kind of technocratic approach to political strategy, meaning the building of infrastructure or the delivery of ministerial services, rather than politics as identity politics, as power sharing, and so if that's the context, what practical steps at this late hour, 9-10 years after the international community invaded the country, what practical steps can international policy take to create a more inclusive politics that will stabilize the country, constrict the space that the Taliban can operate in, short of a grand bargain between the president and the Quetta Shura? What's there to be done that might improve things?
One of the problems is, when you talk about that, is we depend very much on the behavior of the Afghan government. We found it very difficult to find ways to first of all share the objective and then to find the behavior. Very practically, what you would need to have on a low level, on a provincial level, is for government officials or security officials or people linked to government or people linked to our military forces to stop practices of tribal targeting, to stop practices of abuse of power. A very strong driver of the insurgency, at least on the sort of the mid-local level, is a sense of grievance, is a sense of revenge for wrongs that have been done, but also there's no place for me and my group in this government, under this government. And so one of the most important things would be that messages are sent that this is a more inclusive government, not just for a group of friends and their friends, it's very difficult to know how we as internationals should do anything about that, because we've put ourselves in this straitjacket of Afghan lead, where we say we're supporting the Afghan government. That is our strategy, and it's we've not found a good way of dealing with that. On a slightly more higher level, when you talk about not necessarily the grand bargain, but much more the negotiations, if they take place, an actual reconciliation strategy. Again, we've somehow put that in the hands of the Karzai government. Have said they must be in the lead. It must be a government plan, which is fine if it's reintegration, because with reintegration, people come and said, we are joining this government. We are leaving our side and coming over to that side. For reconciliation and negotiations, it's not fine if one of the two sides are in the lead. That's complicated. And I think that would have been a very a good opportunity for the international community to play a role as a mediator, as a broker, as an observer, to try and take that role much more. It would have been a very good potential role for the UN, not UNAMA, because UNAMA has been quite tainted by the past elections, but to possibly have a special envoy for reconciliation, for a peace process. I think there could have been a much larger role for an independent international presence, rather than an international presence that is supporting the government, which is part of the conflict.
And you didn't mention, but I'm curious to hear you talk about sort of constitutional institutions like the parliament and constitutional processes such as the pursuit of a more inclusive provincial, sub-provincial, district, sub-district governance system, which the sort of post-Bonn regime ended up stillborn in 2004, 2005, and now we have a country where no mayor is elected, no town council is elected, no governor is elected. And so this messaging of inclusion that you think is important has to be done in an undemocratic, top-down, ad hoc way. So it's very late in the day to be talking about these issues, but I wonder, we do have a parliament that is lively, increasingly independent. Parliamentary elections are ahead. What's your assessment of the role that institution can play in a politics of inclusion, and what are its limitations? And then, is there the potential to return to this question of constitutional design as part of a reconciliation process, so that it's not just about deal-making above the heads of the Afghan people?
The parliament is a very interesting institution, because it has a level of independence. It also has a level of randomness. If you're in parliament, you have certain power, but you also have commodities. You can sell your vote. You can try to get people appointed. You can sell your influence. So it goes both ways. It's an institution with influence, which can have a role towards greater accountability, but it also has its own. It's also part of the system very much, the patronage system, the system where you use your positions for possible gain. It is the relationship between the parliament and Karzai is tense. I think in general in Afghanistan, and in many countries, not just in Afghanistan, people in power would like to be not so much controlled or commented on or criticized on, and so I think he would very much like to have a slightly more cooperative parliament next time. And that brings me also to your next question, the constitutional reforms. The reforms in itself, the system in itself, gives the potential of more inclusion. But it doesn't necessarily give more inclusion, because at the moment we have a situation where almost all systems can be redirected or misused, and as long as that's not solved, and a lot of really continues to come back to who controls those who are in power, who makes sure that those who are in power play by the rules, and that's a very difficult one to. It has to be step by step and incremental. You can't do it by strategy or by program, but almost everything comes back to that question.
What do you expect in the parliamentary elections in in the autumn.
Yeah. I mean, basically, trying to manipulate the outcome of the elections has become a part of the competition. It's a competition of skills, so not just the competition in campaigning and popular support, but also which skills do you have to actually do that. So that will be there. It will be not as widespread and blatant as last year, because just simply you don't need as many votes to win. So it can be smaller scale fraud. But people will know, so they will also be trying to catch the others out, and it will be quite a noisy process also, where you if you can, you do your own fraud or your own adding of votes, but you make a noise about your rivals who do it, and it's become part of the process.
So as you finished your introductory remarks, you referred to the question of stay or go, and we're all, as analysts, to some extent prisoners of our own experience, and my own began in 1989 when the Soviet Union had just left and had left behind a government that it was supporting and arming and funding. And one of the factors at that time that shaped the devastating events of the 1990s was that almost as soon as President Gorbachev made his bleeding wound speech and signaled that the Soviet Union was leaving, Afghans and their neighbors, the Pakistani army and others, began to move around, positioning themselves for the day when the Soviets would be gone. And what that produced was a lot of internal conflict, as well as positioning to win the day after the Soviets left. I wonder if something similar isn't happening now. Most of the NATO allies have announced a specific date by which they intend to leave. The United States has announced a date that isn't quite as clear in its meaning, but clearly is the same equivalent as the bleeding wound speech. And so what are the consequences within the Afghan groups that have been seeking rent from this international intervention, have been strengthening themselves for the day now when we're gone? And talk about it in whatever way you think is the most useful. A common way would be to talk about it in terms of ethnic identity, North versus South. But it may be that the patterns are different in your estimation.
Yeah, we're all very closely watching the North-South, or sort of the Pashtun, non-Pashtun, particularly because we have the baggage of history. So far, it's there potentially, but because there's been this history of fighting, there's also the fear of the return to that fighting. So there's both. There's leaders who would seek to use it, but there's also sort of currents the other way who are really trying to mitigate and say we don't want to go back to that. If you push that too hard as a leader, that might actually undermine you because. People just fear for the consequences. So that's actually quite a mixed picture, and it's not necessarily clear that will be the main fault lines. What I'm hoping, because of course a lot of us are thinking back to that and looking at the parallels and the differences. Afghanistan is not the same as Afghanistan, the Afghanistan that it was then, and it's become much more connected to the rest of the world. It also has much more that desire to become connected, and particularly economically. There's a lot of very strong economic networks that get money from the international intervention, but also from other sources. And so to have a country descend again in civil war, it gives economic opportunities, but it also disrupts some of that. So there's a possibility, I don't know enough about it, but there's a possibility that could be quite an important factor in somehow keeping it together, although an unraveling is always unexpected and by events that start moving suddenly. People, or Afghans, I think were quite worried about the talk of a deadline. On the other hand, there's so much being said all the time that it's difficult for people also to take things at face value. So there's this fear that the internationals will leave, that the Americans will leave. There's also a fear that they will not leave. that they actually mean to stay for a very long time. And we've had now these reports about the $1 trillion of minerals in the ground, and so there's all kinds of thoughts. Again, a mixed picture. People are definitely, but different groups are definitely positioning themselves. I think Karzai is one of the main ones who's been repositioning himself. But there is a sense that even though the internationals might leave, they will still stay. There will still be an involvement. Even though the bulk of the military might go, there will still probably be a military presence unless it goes horribly wrong. So you bet on many horses.
And so something like what you just described at the end, I think, is actually U.S. policy. That is, in the shortest possible time, to move from the deployment of thousands of U.S. and allied soldiers in direct combat in Taliban country, to move from that reality this summer to one in which increasingly the forces that are deployed in contested areas are Afghan forces with subordinate support from the international community, making sure they maintain a monopoly on the skies and have better equipment and so forth. And that ultimately, as is occurring to some extent in a zigzag pattern in Iraq today, the troops move back into the cities, spend more time on bases and in support, and eventually just embed themselves in an Afghan government that is more or less, while hardly perfect, more or less fending for itself and in control of a majority of its territory, as you would see today in Colombia or the Philippines or other troubled but essentially stable and self-governing countries. So I guess if that's the policy, that's the strategy, and the hope is that you can get there by 2015 or 2014 or as soon as possible. Do you think that that's plausible? And is that a way of neither staying nor going that is responsive to the conditions in Afghanistan? If you don't believe that's the right strategy, what would you recommend an alternative?
I think it's plausible. I think it's a strategy that could happen. I think it's probably. Let me say something. Let me look at it from the other side. Looking at it from talking to Afghans, how they would respond to what they somehow feel might be coming. Obviously, the number one concern and wish is stability. Please keep our country together. Don't make it descend into outright civil war again. But once that is covered, they would like to have a government that they don't feel ashamed of, or that they don't that doesn't upset them. And they would also like to have local security. And one of the big concerns about this model is that to do this, you would link yourself to, we say we strengthen the national security forces, but in practice, you're going to link yourself to many of the groups, the armed groups that we have now, that do road security, that are private security companies, that are linked to the special forces. And it's fine to link yourself to local armed groups, but a lot of these groups are very factional and can do whatever they want. And that's a big concern for people, that it might look as a sort of a country that it's okay, it's stable enough. But for daily life, it can be quite unpleasant and uncomfortable. So it's hard to. I think it is hard to think of a strategy that's wildly different, that wildly varies from this. What counts is to tweak it and to actually work on it to make sure that it harm reduction, damage control, get the worst out. Don't give power to the worst people. Don't sow the seeds for the future conflicts already. And just to go back to this, and we'll wrap up and invite the audience in a minute, but just to go back to this political, constitutional, diplomatic
context in which the strategy we've just sort of surrounded and tweaked occurs. One of the puzzles to me about international strategy over the last couple of years is that the Obama administration came in saying that it was going to smother Afghanistan in regional diplomacy. It was going to really reinforce stability by trying to create conditions in which the neighbors who have interfered with the country's politics and for so long and intervened in proxy war for so long would be persuaded to convert their efforts to something more collectively constructive, and that this would be connected to a more inclusive internal politics, neither of which has really developed. So, is that plausible anymore? Is it too late? There's always this tension in the way the international community has approached Afghanistan between the expediency of security, the armed groups on the road, and the knowledge that a balanced, fractious country requires politics, inclusive politics. So is it possible to go back to that original premise, or is it too ambitious, itself destabilizing?
No, I think it needs to be tried, and I don't think it's too late to be tried. Whether it will succeed is a different one. It's also whether we collectively actually have the international savvy to do that. The political savvy to do that, and particularly because we're trying to do so many things at the same time, as you said. But yeah, I would say it definitely still needs to be tried. It's a big one. I mean, it would be very difficult to stabilize Afghanistan without the region being a part of that, and the region cooperating in that regard. Pakistan, Iran in particular.
So one last question. In Kabul, when you speak to Afghans, and obviously Afghanistan is a very diverse place, so you'll hear lots of different perspectives, but what is the perception of Pakistan's role in their country today, and what does that imply about what the international community should be doing to try to coerce Pakistan to change its conduct?
Well, there's a sort of a very generalized narrative, and very negative narrative of Pakistan has always been interfering. Pakistan has always wanted us to be, a weak neighbor, and so people watch the increased role of Pakistan and the coming closer of their government and the Pakistani government with a lot of concern. They believe the Americans and the other internationals have been tricked before. When they worked through Pakistan during the jihad, and they're slightly bewildered that they might be seeing a repeat of that, and I think that's quite good to keep in mind.
Good. Well, let's take some questions from the audience. See a hand there in the second row. We'll start there and move back and forth.
Hi.
There's a microphone coming. If you could just identify yourself.
Lindsay Kuhn from the Middle East Policy Council. I'm curious how you think the minerals that have been recently discovered in Afghanistan, do you believe that investments from the international community will help promote stability within Afghanistan or hurt it?
Yeah, I'm in no way an expert. So what I say on that is as good as anybody else's opinion. I find it quite difficult to believe that there would be any profit coming out of that anytime soon. Given the situation in Afghanistan, how difficult it is to invest, and the amount of infrastructure you would need, also how difficult it is just to deal with the laws and the government in the country. So just practically, I can't see that developing very soon. A lot of the mines are also in quite insecure areas. The idea that there's a lot of wealth to be had can, of course, be very destabilizing, both internally and regionally. So, yeah, in the short term, I don't see it leading to a booming economy, which the country needs, and it might actually lead to further conflict and competition.
Yes, in the front row here. We'll just go back and forth.
Matthias Kieska, Embassy of Austria. According to Al Jazeera, Karzai himself talked to Haqqani on the weekend. First, you think the reports are true, and second, assuming that there can be a deal with the Afghan government and the Haqqani network, is it possible to keep Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan? Is it possible to separate the Haqqanis from Al-Qaeda and the Quetta Shura?
I don't know if it's true or not. There's quite regularly reports in Afghanistan about all kinds of talks between groups, and usually the sense you get is that there's not as much as seems to be suggested, but there's probably more than nothing. And I also do think it's an attempt to keep Haqqani on the stage. I mean, obviously, if there's a potential for a deal, everybody wants to be part of it. So you want to keep your name out there. What it would mean practically in terms of also Al-Qaeda, basically now we're talking about it in the dark, because what would it mean? A deal between who? What would it look like? I find it first of all difficult to envisage a deal with Haqqani, which would mean that he would return or he would join, the fight would stop, delinking with Al-Qaeda. So I guess my answer to your question would be no, but a little bit earlier. It's not so much they cannot delink themselves from Al-Qaeda if there's a deal, but it would be quite difficult to envisage what a deal like that would look like. Doesn't mean that we might still be presented with something that is presented as a deal with Haqqani. But my guess would be that doesn't mean they stop fighting, doesn't mean they stop existing, doesn't mean they're no longer a threat. They might, they might be convinced to stop violence for a while to suggest that the deal is there. But I find it very difficult to believe there wouldn't be an actual one.
Yes, in the front row here. If you could just wait for the microphone, please.
Usually I don't need a microphone.
Yeah, well.
I presume you're recording. I'm Atul Singh. I'm CEO of ATID Global, and I did special operations against the Taliban in the pre-9/11 days, during the time when no one was noticing them. And I come from South Asia, I grew up there. And one of the things that I would like to push you further on, and I think you've been very nuanced, is that the terms, the constitutional structure, the government structure, these things do not mean much in that part of the world in many ways. They mean in, let's say, Kabul, but Karzai doesn't really run too much outside Kabul. And similarly, when you talk about Pakistani government structures, there's no one entity. There are 20 competing factions, even in the ISI. There are people who have emotional, ties and ties of patronage to the Taliban. There are modernizers. So my whole question to you is, in such a shifting environment, do you see American diplomats and American policymakers as having the wherewithal and the ability and just the awareness, leave all this aside, to be able to navigate the situation, navigate the environment, and come up with something plausible? Because a lot of times I feel that things are so naive. I mean, and there's not even awareness, leave aside knowledge or understanding.
Good question.
Yeah, I think absolutely right. There's a huge underestimation of the savviness of. I'll speak about Afghans because I know about that. When you see internationals deal with Afghans, often there's this assumption that because many of them are illiterate, there's a lack of understanding, or whereas what you are describing is higher maths. To be operating in an environment of constantly shifting relationships and power relationships, and your survival depends on that. So many Afghans, for them this is second nature. It's not for us. Absolutely right. Not just because it's not our country and not our culture, but also our types of politics are different. And so yes, there's a huge lack of knowledge. There's a huge lack of history, of memory. Also, a lot of people, a lot of the diplomats who work there are very short. There's a lack of awareness. It is a problem. I was talking a couple of days ago to quite a senior diplomat who said, just anything that requires deep understanding of the situation, forget it. Don't factor that into your strategy. But it's a problem because we are there. We would like it to go well, and without a better understanding, it will not. And it's something we're stuck in.
The
So
entire thing is, if without awareness and understanding, you can't have strategy. And I see this whole mishmash, and history goes a long way. I mean, I come from that part of the world.
yeah. Good. Let's share the floor. In the back there on the right. Yes, to your left, and then we'll come back to you. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Yusuf Azim. I'm an Afghan American. I served 4 years in the United States Marine Corps. I'm currently working at the Afghan embassy this summer. Everything's looking very bleak with McChrystal gone, Karzai talking the Haqqani network, and the military not going, the Pakistani military not going to northern Waziristan and whatnot. A lot of news about Afghanistan lately is start to catch the attention of members in Congress. Speaker Pelosi told the Huffington Post that there will be an immediate withdrawal in 2011. The chairwoman of the House Subcommittee on Appropriations for Foreign Operations is cutting the funding for Afghan aid. Kandahar seems like the last hope in order to start to gain more public support here in America. The Marja strategy was a clear hold and build strategy, and 4 months later we're still in the clear strategy. With Kandahar coming, what do you see that we should do differently than what we're doing in Marja in order to fix things in Kandahar? Thank you.
Write the Kandahar campaign plan.
Yeah, I would have if I had one. It's a difficult one. I think what you say is exactly right. Kandahar is our chance of turning around perceptions here, and I think that was Marja and Kandahar were designed for the perceptions here. I do think there was a hope and maybe a belief that it could change the momentum in Afghanistan as well. But it didn't, and also a lot of us who were sort of watching it didn't expect it to. The problem, as we said before, as everybody keeps saying, you cannot do this militarily. You cannot do this militarily. You will not change things around in Kandahar through a military strategy. There's a huge sense of sort of despair. There's a sense of fear in Kandahar, which is not only linked to the Taliban. It's also linked to local power groups and how they treat people. You will not solve that through going in with your military. And so it needs as we've been saying for years now, it needs a strategy that combines all parts, but also as we've been experiencing for years, we don't really have the knowledge or the awareness or the finesse to do that. And also it doesn't fit with, as we discussed before, the hurry we're in. So it was quite telling, I think, that General McChrystal decided to postpone the Kandahar operation. I think it was quite positive. In the past, when we weren't sure what to do, we went ahead. And I think it's quite good if you're not sure what to do and if you're not sure it's going to help, to sort of hold off and look again. But yeah.
And so if I could just follow up to apply some of the principles that you articulated earlier to the problem of Kandahar, it seemed as if one of the reasons why they delayed when they got to the edge of Kandahar and they looked at the political component of their strategy, they seemed to recognize that they had no confidence in cause and effect in the city and in the province. In particular, the problem of AWK and the perception of his networks as being a source of grievance and alienation locally, but then the international community not having a strategy to address that, and at the same time afraid if it confronted the president's brother that there would be rebound effects that would themselves perhaps be worse than passivity. So that some version of that led to the paralysis that said, okay, let's just stop. Now, so if you're going to start again and not and try to avoid tribal targeting, to use your phrase, and try to avoid associating yourself with corrupt and predatory groups and so forth, and you're looking at the reality of Kandahar and the despair of the population, what can you do to at least make things move in a better direction, if not solve all of the political military problems of the province?
It's a difficult one because I think things in Kandahar have gone quite far. The mood is bad in quite a bad way, more than in other parts of the countries, but the echoes are there in the other parts of the countries. And when I was there last, about 2 months ago, there was really sort of not just a loss of confidence in the ability of the internationals to do something, but a loss of confidence in the intentions of the international community. And actually in every single conversation there was a version of they are actually here to harm us, which is very worrying. And it's difficult to turn that around. And that had to do with linking the fact that we're linked to groups who cause grievances. It's very much linked to the fact that why the question in people's minds: how is it possible that the military have been here for so many years and things are only getting worse? That must be intentional. That must be strategy. That cannot be incompetence, or that cannot be something else. It also had to do with the fact that people were suffering, and I think it's okay to suffer in warfare if you feel that it goes somewhere. So there was this feeling towards the Kandahar campaign is it's going to bring suffering. It will not help. What should you do differently? I think large parts of the populations are looking for signals that there is actually a commitment to rectify some of this, to change it. And so you cannot change the whole government. And you cannot, because it's so pervasive, the patronage and the and all kinds of small and little, big and small abuses of power. But that there's some commitment at the top of the government and at the top of the international community to get rid of some of the worst, to turn back of it, to deal with, for instance, the brother of the president in a way that would not allow him to do some of the worst excesses. You cannot ignore him. You cannot get rid of him. But again, I wouldn't want to say at the fringes, but at where it counts, where it hurts people most, to make some changes there, and at least to give back some hope that we might actually be heading in a direction where things are getting better.
And where does the performance of the local government led by the president's brother seem the worst to local people? Is it extortion, extrajudicial violence, where you get on the wrong side of the racketeers and they just take you down with impunity? Or what is it that is the source of the despair in the multiple patterns of government failure that are around people?
I think it's the behavior. It is the extortion, it's the killings, it's the violence. But what's worst is that is the fact that they're untouchable, that there's nowhere to go with your complaint. And I think what is particularly, what bothers people particularly is that there's often links to international military, and it is particularly the links to international military which give a lot of power, because that is how you can brand your enemies as insurgents or as Taliban and get them targeted.
There's a fellow in the back there with his hand up.
Thank you very much. I'm Iftikhar Hussain, work for Voice of America, pastor to the Border Region Service. Talking to Taliban at this stage, don't you think what gave them upper hand in the post-withdrawal composition and scenario? Because many Pashtun, liberal Pashtuns, I would say, and also the minority groups, they feel they've been defeated if the United States withdraw with this situation, leaving Afghanistan with militants being around there. And also, I'm thinking why the Haqqani group has been kept at the center stage of now when there is talk of reconciliation. And so Pakistan and the Afghanistan government, there are reports they are reaching out to them. He has been sheltering Osama bin Laden. So such kind of groups, we understand. I come from the heartland of Pashtun, from Peshawar. We understand that they are not a monolithic group. But don't you think they're the proxies faces of the neighboring countries, and they would be the same game as before it was? Thank you.
Yep. What we haven't done in this conversation so far, but what also doesn't happen very often, is to distinguish actually what do we mean, first of all, by talks, but what do we mean by talking to the Taliban? Because there's, again, this whole range of what that could mean, ranging from grand bargain to very local sort of reconciliation or reintegration. And so basically, in a way, your question goes back to if you talk to Haqqani, you are then you're talking to a very different kind of insurgent than if you're talking to the Quetta, Shura, and or if you're talking to even lower level Taliban commanders. It has a different flavor to it. Some of it is really what you would be saying. It's one thing to be talking to terrorist groups. It's another to be talking to groups who are fighting for grievances. It's another who's for a group who are fighting because they're against the government. There's all kinds of different nuances to that, and that is often not fleshed out enough, and it seems like it will probably be made up as we go along. On your question on whether it's not too late, or whether it would give the Taliban the upper hand, I think we've somehow not helped ourselves in the way how we define upper hand. We've looked at it in a very military way. So we've said we will talk to the Taliban as soon as we have the upper hand, which is also, it's not a very fair way in a way to go into negotiations, if you want to do negotiations, if you would be serious about it. But it also looks at it in a very military way. And by implication, you're saying, in a way, they're too strong to our liking now. We shouldn't talk to them. We need to become a little bit stronger first. Whereas I think there's quite compelling reasons, at least for parts of the movement, why they would want to talk. Some of them simply are just really tired and would like to go home. And that's, I think every military commander who comes into Afghanistan has always said there's an increasing group of people who are tired of war and who want to go home. I actually think it's probably quite a stable group of people. It's part of the war effort. There are always people who are looking for ways to stop. But it is something that could gain momentum if there's a good way of actually being able to stop. There's also, it's not necessarily obviously that the Taliban would get more by continuing the fight than they would be by talks. It's also not obvious that it's not the case. But you don't need to beat them into submission for them to possibly be interested in talking about that. I do think we've lost momentum, and I think particularly there was momentum with the coming of the Obama administration. There was sort of a worldwide feeling, and also in Afghanistan, of maybe there will be change, maybe there will be a different kind of America. The fact that it was assumed that maybe he was a Muslim or not. There were all these kinds of reasons why there was an interest, and sort of the potential for a new way of dealing with things. I do think that's been quite lost. from the ground, the strategy looks very similar to before. But it's not too late, but there was an opportunity that we lost.
Can I just follow up on the last 6 or 8 weeks have been kind of puzzling, and maybe this is just a reflection of news cycles and what happens in the media rather than something authentic. But this whole question of reconciliation, top-level reconciliation talks, 6 months ago, 3-4 months ago, was located in the idea that there were elements of the Quetta Shura who wanted freedom from Pakistani control, who were interested in principle and the possibility of power sharing, as other previously armed groups had been interested in. And that Karzai had an interest in reaching out to those elements of the Quetta Shura. And that there was a history of contacts. In the last 6 weeks, the subject has changed from dissidents in the Quetta Shura to the Haqqanis, which seems odd. And if you were conspiracy-minded, you might think that it was in the interest of the government of Pakistan to change the narrative. But there's no evidence that I'm aware of that the Haqqanis are themselves signaling any interest in such talks. No. So where does this come from?
No, again, I don't know, but my guess would be what you're saying. I think it's my guess would be from the Pakistani side staking a claim. If there's anything, they should be part of it. We should be part of it also, as brokers or as part of that. That would be my guess. What has also brought it center stage, and I think probably we got a little bit more than we asked for, is that within the international community after the elections, there was this whole sense of crisis. What kind of country is this, and what kind of government is this, and what do we have to work with? And so very quickly it went in sort of this mode, let's go into conference mode. And have this sequence of events which somehow will stabilize things. So we had the London conference, the Peace Jirga, we'll have the Kabul conference, and then we'll have the elections again. And that's sort of this sequence that will somehow give some sense of reassurance. And so, the London conference was very much Karzai and the internationals patching up, Karzai committing to what was considered important. And then there was the Peace Jirga, which was mainly designed to get the what you would call the popular endorsement of the government plan towards reconciliation. My sense is that the internationals would have liked it to be more on the reintegration side. The talk was obviously during the Jirga more on reconciliation, the return of our disgruntled brothers, which is very much on the mind of I would say, probably fairly across the board, all Afghans, even the groups who are really worried about what that might bring. But there is this sense of whoever wants to stop fighting should be able to come back. But then Karzai himself took it quite a few steps further. And he's pushing for the release of Taliban prisoners. He's pushing for taking all Afghans off the 1267 list, the UN blacklist. And there seems to be this huge push to forgive and forget when it comes to the Taliban, and to be open to any other kind of talks, which is early, because that's what you do once there's a process.
How do you interpret the resignations of Amrullah and the Interior Minister?
I think it's a combination of relationships that have been strained over a very long time, and immediate events. Three things: strained relationships over a very long time, a lack of trust also between Karzai and these two officials. Also, we internationals don't really do ministers a favor by very publicly being fond of them and and thinking and saying how great they are. It makes their life more difficult. There was also the issue of the incident during the Jirga, which Karzai blamed them for. Also just that this is not the Taliban, this was something else. How do you explain it? And then I think from their side, and particularly when it comes to Amrullah, real concern about where this is going, and a real fear that Karzai is just ready to give it all away, instead of going into a proper process where you actually distinguish, but just to give it all away.
Yes, I promised him a question there with the hand up. Yes.
Thank you very much. William Seymour, International Peace Quest Institute. Recently, President Karzai's tax records were released, and it listed him as having a salary lower than I think a local government employee would have in the United States, much less a state or national employee, and that he had very little in terms of assets. I think only about 11,000 in terms of jewelry and other things at his house. I mean, this, especially after the controversy that he had rigged the election just not too long ago, that had him looking more like a personal power leader that you see in places like Africa so prominently, and yet they usually had opulent mansions, like, you know, in everywhere you could look, and he doesn't seem to have that. So does that change the kind of, I mean, what kind of ruler is he then if there's potentially rigged an election but doesn't have personal wealth, or is he just really good at hiding his personal wealth from the tax authorities? I don't know, but anyway, whatever you think about that.
I noticed that also. I didn't have time to look in it very deeply. The assets itself, it's self-declared. People have to fill in a form and then that's published. It's not investigated. So that might answer one thing. But Afghans usually know who buys new houses and who buys new shopping malls and hotels, and you don't hear that of Karzai. You don't hear that he personally amasses a large number of a lot of public property. He doesn't necessarily need to. He's very much a network man. He has brothers who are extremely wealthy, and for instance, when it comes to the elections and all the resources that's needed for that, there are a lot of people or a lot of political actors who will do that from their funds in exchange for political favors after that. I find it a very interesting process, the asset declaration. Of course, it looks slightly amusing to get a declaration like that, but it is. It won't change people's behaviors, but it is again it's better than nothing, and it is very interesting for the population that the president has to do that. And even though he sends something that they don't believe, it's an interesting step forward. And what's going to be more interesting is the asset declaration after people leave power, politicians leave power, and
Great. So one or two more questions. Yes, there, right. Yes, with his hand still up. Thank you.
Hi, I'm a student at the University of Dallas in Texas, and you were talking about the potential Pakistani interests that might be in Afghanistan after the U.S. forces might leave. Can you talk of the potential interest that India might have in Afghanistan? Because I extremely apologize for not having an official source, but I do believe that they've distributed aid that amasses over $100 million to certain regions in Afghanistan, and I do believe that they have 4 consulates right now in the border region somewhere in Afghanistan. Thank you.
I've not studied that as well as I've studied Afghan politics, but it's clear both India and Pakistan are using Afghanistan as a competition ground. My guess is India is quite worried now, with Pakistan gaining more influence within the Afghan government. In the past, India had the upper hand there. So I think the most direct interest would be watch very closely. What is Pakistan doing there? Is it going to harm us? What can we do to undermine that? Apart from that, India has supported Afghanistan, quite considerably. There's also been very strong links between Karzai and India, because Karzai studied in India, and I think that's sort of a little bit disappointing now. I think how the turn that the relations are getting.
Disappointing to the
For
Indians.
Indians,
Yes,
to the Indians.
so, Yes. Okay, in the front here, and then we'll wrap up the formal part of the program.
One of the outcomes of the London conference was that the plan would be that in the upcoming Kabul conference, the plan for reintegration and reconciliation would be presented, and then the international community would release the funding. What's your prediction for the upcoming conference? And if I'm allowed a second question, you've been based in Tehran. What's your take on the interest of Tehran in Afghanistan? There are clear indicators of the Iranians supporting the Taliban on the one side, but on the other side, Ahmadinejad visiting the president, etc.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. The London conference, the Kabul conference. I have to admit I don't follow the Kabul conference very closely.
You were blogging from it, though, from the Peace Jirga.
Yeah, that's the Peace Jirga. No,
Right,
the Peace Jirga we followed very closely. The Kabul conference,
You were twittering from the Peace Jirga, I believe.
No, I was passing other people's Twitters. I'll answer the one on the Peace and Reconciliation Plan first. I've seen older versions of it, not the most recent ones. It's being sort of redone all the time. What I understand is that most of the money is going to be for the reintegration fund, and also if the Afghan government gets its way, for considerable discretionary funds for the president and the provincial governors to spend as they see fit, which I'm not sure. I would say many of the donors are not so keen on that because there's very little accountability on where it goes, and it's often spent on giving turbans or lunches or things like that, but the costs are quite high. What it will do, I think the reintegration plan has quite a few problems, and we've been writing about that. It seems modeled on a combination of the old DDR and DIAG, the disarmament programs, and the PTS, the Takim Sol, the old reintegration programs. Both of them had as main problems that they got in people who were not necessarily big fighters, important when it comes to the disarmament, or important insurgent leaders. And there's a huge potential for farmers, shepherds, anybody to join. So it's something you can report on in terms of numbers, but the impact of it, and you can spend money on, which is something that, we have huge pressures to spend money because that's how we report on what we do. But the impact of that is quite likely to be very limited on the reintegration side of things. On the more political track, the versions I'd seen were not very much developed on that, so I'd be very interested to see what happens there. The Kabul conference in itself, what the impact will be, it's very much, it's something between donors and the government. We don't follow it very closely because it doesn't really feature in Afghan politics very much, or in Afghan everyday discussions. What's interesting about the Kabul conference is I've been reading that it's supposed to not just talk about the plans and what the donors will do, but also to come up with a compact between the government and the Afghan people, which is interesting to do that at a conference between the government and the donors without any involvement, as far as I can see, of the Afghan people or any consultation. But yeah, we'll see what that brings.
And Iran?
Iran, I think, is in touch with every single group they can be in touch with. Very well networked, not necessarily doing very much with that, but there's a potential. There's a lot of potential switches that can be switched if they sort of feel they're in a corner or under threat, or if it would be useful to stir up problems in Afghanistan. I think that would be my assessment.
Great. Well, I think we'll bring the questioning to a close. Thank you, Martina, for taking the time to be with us. I think you can all see the quality of her work, and I'd urge you to become acquainted with it online. I think if you just Google Afghan Analyst Network, it'll come right up there. Yeah. And don't forget to subscribe to the Afghan Daily Brief from foreignpolicy.com. You'll find it at the AFPAC channel there. Thanks very much for attending and for your time and questions.